Would you believe me if I said urban hell existed thousands of years ago? Today we're going back in time to look at some of its earliest examples. But first, let's look at the world right now. Some cities today have more than 30 million people living together in one huge connected area. These are called hyper-megacities, massive regions where the population is larger than many entire countries. Millions of people compete for the same jobs, the same homes, and the same roads. When these areas grow faster than they're planned for, apartments shrink, neighborhoods become crowded, and traffic becomes a daily waste of time, not just a small problem once in a while. Cities were meant to make life easier, but for many people, they've made it harder. 1980s, Kowloon walled city. You're looking at a whole city packed into one small block. From above, it looks like one solid rectangle of rooftops with almost no streets. This place was called the Kowloon Walled City in Hong Kong, and it was the world's densest city ever. About 33,000 people lived here in only 2.6 hectares of land, which is more than 1.2 million people per square kilometer. It started as a small Chinese military fort, and in 1847, the Qing built up the defenses to keep an eye on British Hong Kong nearby. In 1898, Britain leased the new territories for 99 years, but the treaty basically left this little fort area in a weird legal gap. Then the Qing dynasty collapsed, nobody wanted a diplomatic fight over a few crowded blocks, and the place turned into a hands-off no man's land. After World War II, refugees poured in, and the walled city grew fast because it was cheap and nobody checked paperwork. It wasn't one building, but hundreds of buildings stacked and patched over decades, with new floors added whenever someone felt brave. The alleys down low could be about 70 centimeters wide, and some parts barely saw daylight. And because Kai Tak Airport was right next door, buildings couldn't go much higher than about 13 or 14 stories, so the city just packed tighter instead. People built bridges and paths across rooftops, so you could cross the whole place above ground like it was a cramped little second street network. Families created a close community with clinics, small factories, shops, and a lot of unlicensed dentists ready to pull a tooth for cheap. If you've seen those cross-section drawings, they're so detailed it feels like a Where's Waldo puzzle. In the 1950s through the 1970s, triad gangs ran big parts of the place, and police didn't stroll in unless they came in numbers. Finally, in 1973 and 1974, Hong Kong police hit it with more than 3,500 raids, made over 2,500 arrests, and seized about 1,800 kilograms of drugs. In January 1987, the government announced it was coming down, so demolition started in March 1993, and by April 1994, the whole block was rubble. Since then it's been transformed into a park, but the old yamen and gate still remain. 1945, aftermath of World War II. World War II revealed what modern technology was capable of doing. Strategic bombing campaigns, firestorms, and ultimately, nuclear weapons proved that entire cities could be erased in seconds. During the Blitz in 1940 and 1941, German Luftwaffe bombers struck London night after night, turning daily life into sirens, smoke, and collapsing streets. Neighborhoods were flattened, docks burned along the Thames, and thousands of civilians were killed as the city struggled to function under constant attack. By February 1945, Dresden faced an even more devastating assault, where waves of bombing created a firestorm so intense it pulled oxygen from the air. Baroque buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened shells and ash within hours. Before the war, Warsaw was one of the most densely populated cities in Europe, but by 1945, around 85 to 90% of its center was left in ruins. On August 6, 1945, a single atomic bomb detonated above Hiroshima, and in seconds the city center was erased, with tens of thousands killed instantly and many more dying from burns and radiation. Across Europe and Asia, blocks of apartments, shops, and factories were reduced to piles of brick. Streets were still visible from the air, but there were no roofs, no glass, and no normal life left underneath. After the war, rebuilding was not about fixing a few damaged blocks, it meant reconstructing entire capitals from the ground up. Millions of people across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union needed homes fast, while rapid industrialization pushed workers into expanding urban centers. Starting in the mid-1950s, governments began building huge numbers of apartment blocks using prefabricated concrete panels. Factories produced walls, floors, and stair sections, and cranes stacked them together like building blocks, allowing whole neighborhoods to appear quickly. Among the urban hell community, these buildings are commonly referred to as commie blocks, long rows of nearly identical 5 to 10-story gray buildings with repeating windows and flat roofs. Inside, apartments were small but modern for the time, usually 2 or 3 rooms with central heating and indoor plumbing, but the walls were usually so thin you could learn your neighbor's whole schedule without ever meeting them. These buildings were not designed to last forever, yet many still stand today, housing millions and remaining part of the skyline decades after the war that made them necessary. 1920. Iron Forest. This might look like a normal beach in California at first, until you look a little further. It seems that next to this beach is a forest where instead of pine trees, there are drilling towers and pump jacks. This is Huntington Beach in the early 1920s, right after oil was discovered here. On May 24, 1920, a well called Huntington A1 struck oil, and everything changed almost overnight. Within about a month, the town's population jumped from roughly 1,500 people to around 5,000, because everyone suddenly wanted in. By late 1921, there were dozens of producing wells and the field was pumping around 16,500 barrels of oil a day. The skyline was filled with beams, cables, and pump jacks, while just a few meters away people were laying out towels and swimming in the Pacific. Locals started calling it the Iron Forest, and for a while the town was known as Oil City, even as it tried to sell itself as a beach escape. In 1921 and 1922, as drilling expanded, some houses sitting on valuable land were physically moved about 10 kilometers north to clear space for more wells. Some pump jacks did not run all day but were set on timers, so a quiet rig could suddenly start moving again without warning, making living feel like you were next to a giant metal animal that wakes up whenever it wants. By the 1930s, Huntington Beach was one of the most productive oil fields in California, with hundreds of wells crowding the coastline. 1906, San Francisco earthquake. At 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, the ground suddenly tore along a huge crack in the earth called the San Andreas Fault, and San Francisco shook hard for about 40 seconds. The shaking was so strong that people felt it from Oregon down to Los Angeles. In almost an instant, buildings collapsed, walls split open, and streets buckled under the force. Some steel and stone buildings remained standing, but most wooden buildings either collapsed or were badly damaged. The earthquake was around magnitude 7.9, but the worst destruction came from what happened next. Gas pipes broke, stoves tipped over, and fires started in many parts of the city at the same time. More than 30 fires merged into huge firestorms that burned for 4 days and destroyed about 25,000 buildings. Firefighters tried to stop the flames, but the city's water pipes were damaged, so there was little water pressure to fight back. They even used dynamite to blow up buildings to create fire breaks, but some of those explosions started new fires instead. More than 3,000 people died, and many deaths were never officially recorded, especially in poorer neighborhoods. Around 250,000 people were left homeless out of a population of about 410,000, which meant most of the city had nowhere to live. 1887, Stockholm Telephone Tower. In 1887, Stockholm built a huge telephone tower right in the middle of the city to handle about 5,500 overhead phone lines. At the time, Stockholm was one of the most phone-dense cities in the world, so this was the solution they came up with. Instead of burying cables underground, they ran them through the open air and pulled them all toward one central structure. The tower stood about 80 meters tall, and from a distance, it looked like a strange monument. Up close, it looked like a steel skeleton, wrapped in a massive cobweb. Every line stretched across streets and over buildings before meeting at this one point. If something failed here, thousands of people would lose their connection at the same time. People complained that it was ugly and overwhelming, so architects were asked to dress it up with decorative turrets. The result still looked like an industrial cage, just with 4 small towers stuck on top. The system became outdated surprisingly fast once underground cables proved safer and more practical. By 1913, the underground network was finished, and the tower was no longer needed for daily phone traffic. After that, it mostly stood as a giant leftover, carrying advertising signs in later years. But in July of 1952, a fire badly damaged the structure, and in 1953, it was demolished for safety reasons. 1850, worst slum in American history. This was 5 points in the mid-1800s, the most infamous slum in American history. It stood where several streets met at odd angles, forming a confusing intersection that gave the area its name. Before any buildings stood here, this land was a freshwater lake called Collect Pond. The city filled the pond in by 1811 so they could build on it, but the job was rushed and badly engineered. The buried plants rotted, the ground sank, and water pooled back up through the soil. The streets turned into thick mud, mixed with garbage and sewage, with many mosquitoes, poor drainage, and a constant bad smell. By the 1840s and 1850s, poor families crowded into cheap wooden tenements, including Irish immigrants escaping famine and free black New Yorkers living side by side. That kind of close racial mixing was rare for the time, and it made the neighborhood both unique and heavily criticized. Rooms meant for one family often held many, with several people sleeping in a single space, so disease spread easily, and cholera outbreaks in the 1830s hit 5 points especially hard. One building called the Old Brewery became infamous for extreme overcrowding and violence, with hundreds living inside a structure never meant to hold that many people. Riots broke out in the 1850s, and it was said to have one of the highest murder rates in the city. By the late 1800s, reformers tore down the worst blocks, parks replaced some of the narrow streets, and government buildings slowly covered the area, as if the city wanted people to forget what had been there. 1840, Industrial Britain. By the early to mid-19th century, Britain became the world's first industrial society. Cities exploded in size, coal smoke blackened the sky, and whole blocks of worker housing went up fast because factories needed people and people needed beds. Manchester became the world's first true industrial city, packed with cotton mills and tall chimneys burning day and night. Workers lived right next to the factories in tight brick rows, with damp rooms, shared toilets, and dirty streets. And when diseases like cholera hit, overcrowded areas got crushed the hardest. In Glasgow, during the 19th century, huge numbers of people were jammed into tenements, often with whole families in 1 or 2 rooms. Some buildings were so overcrowded that cellars meant for storage were rented out as homes, with little light and almost no fresh air. The city became known for some of the worst slum conditions in Europe, with poverty, smoke, and sickness all stacked on top of each other. London faced similar pressure as it spread outward with long streets of nearly identical working-class housing. It looked dull and repetitive in photos, but it was built to a plan with basic standards, small back gardens, and rail access to work, which was a big step up from the older unplanned slums. These new neighborhoods were considered modern at the time, with schools, nearby parks, and streets laid out in straight lines. But even a century later, the smoke never really cleared. Photos like Leicester in 1954 show rooftops under a thick coal haze, with factory chimneys in the distance, and every house feeding the sky with its own fireplace smoke. So the industrial age didn't just shape Britain's cities, it sat in the air for generations. 1500s, Manhattan of the Desert. They call this place the Manhattan of the Desert, and once you see it, you understand why. This is Shibam in Yemen, a walled city rising straight out of the sand like a cluster of mud brick skyscrapers. The city itself is about 1,800 years old, but most of these towers were rebuilt in the 1500s. Instead of spreading wide across the valley, Shibam built upward. Around 500 towers stand inside the walls, between 5 and 11 stories tall, some reaching nearly 30 meters. And they are not stone or concrete, they are made from sun-dried mud brick. From above, the buildings are packed so tightly they almost touch, creating narrow shaded streets like deep cracks, and this tall design was meant for defense as well as saving space. The city sat on major trade routes, and keeping farmland outside the walls meant food stayed safe while the population stayed protected. The lower floors were used for animals and storage, while families lived higher up, climbing stairs instead of elevators. About 7,000 people still live here today in an area of only around 9 hectares, which makes it incredibly dense for a desert town. But mud is fragile. After heavy rains, workers have to climb up and patch the towers with fresh layers of clay, or the buildings slowly erode back into the earth. 1346. The Black Death. By the 1340s, Europe, North Africa, and Asia were connected by busy trade routes, crowded ports, and constant travel, and that connection became a highway for disease. Most historians believe the plague began in Central Asia and moved toward the Black Sea, and in 1347 it reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, where merchant ships carried it into the Mediterranean. From there it moved the way trade always moved, from port to port, along rivers and roads, reaching cities like Messina, Genoa, Venice, and Marseille within a few years. Medieval cities were built for density, with narrow lanes, shared wells, animals in the streets, houses built close together, garbage in the alleys, and daily life that meant constant contact with neighbors and strangers. When the plague arrived, symptoms came fast. People would feel fine, then suddenly get a high fever, weakness, and painful swollen lumps in the groin or armpit, and many were dead within a few days. Once that started, fear spread almost faster than the disease. Shops closed, families locked their doors, and some households abandoned the sick because staying close could mean death for everyone inside. City systems started to fail as priests, doctors, and gravediggers died or fled, leaving too few workers to handle the dead. Cemeteries overflowed, bodies remained inside homes, and carts carried the dead to mass graves outside city walls. Writers in Florence describe streets falling silent, except for funeral bells, but similar scenes unfolded across Europe and the Mediterranean world. Modern estimates suggest that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died in just a few years, with some cities losing even more. So the urban hell wasn't just the sickness, but watching a living city turn into a place where death was normal, help was gone, and the streets themselves felt unsafe. 1100s, ancient skyscraper city. The Middle Ages were not supposed to have skylines like this, but in the 1100s Bologna looked like Manhattan made of stone. At its peak, somewhere between 90 and maybe 180 towers rose above a tight maze of houses and market streets. Even the lower estimates are extreme for a city of this size. Bologna was booming from trade and from its university, founded in 1088, which drew students from across Europe and filled the city with money and influence. These towers were not some royal projects, but family trophies, built by wealthy clans competing with each other, and the logic was simple. If your tower was taller than your rivals, your family looked stronger and richer. But this height was not just for showing off, because the city was divided by violent factions and street fights were common, so a tall tower meant you could pull up a ladder, block the entrance, and defend your family from above. Most towers had thick stone walls, very small windows, and doors placed high off the ground, making them feel more like vertical bunkers than homes. Some were even connected by wooden bridges between allied families, and when those alliances collapsed, the bridges were torn down. Inside, the lower floors stored goods while the upper floors were used for living. I can imagine climbing the steep, narrow wooden stairs every day must have been exhausting. Over time, weak foundations, political reforms, and earthquakes removed most of the towers, and many were cut down to safer heights. By the modern era, only around 20 remained, including the Torre degli Asinelli, which still stands about 97 meters tall, and the Torre della Garisenda, which had to be shortened after it began to lean during construction. 100 CE, Imperial Rome. The first city to hit 1 million people was not New York or Tokyo, it was Rome. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the capital of the Roman Empire had grown larger than any city the world had ever seen. From a distance it looked glorious, with marble temples, triumphal arches, aqueducts stretching across the horizon, and powerful monuments. But most Romans did not live in marble villas. They lived in insulae, multi-story apartment blocks packed tightly together. These buildings rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 floors high, with strong brick and concrete at the bottom and cheaper, weaker materials at the top. The higher you lived, the poorer you usually were, climbing long stairs every day to reach a cramped room under the roof. Entire families often rented a single small space, sometimes sharing walls and rooms with strangers, with little privacy and almost no fresh air. The streets below were narrow, the windows were small, and sunlight barely reached the lower levels. Noise never stopped, because carts rolled over stone, vendors shouted, animals pushed through alleys, and at night people dumped trash and waste from the upper floors. There was even a hill made from broken olive oil jars called Monte Testaccio, where workers smashed jars that could not be reused. Over many years, the broken pieces formed a man-made hill almost 1 kilometer around and over 40 meters high. Fire was a constant danger because people used open flames for cooking and heating, and wooden beams that supported upper stories made it easy for fires to spread from one building to another. Collapse was another fear, since many landlords built quickly and cheaply to make more money, which was also described by writers who wrote about cracking walls and leaning buildings. At street level, shops and better apartments filled the ground floors, while wealthy people lived elsewhere in large houses with courtyards and fountains. Rome was divided by class floor by floor, with richer people living near the ground and poorer people higher up, and although it had advanced systems for water and sewage, they did not solve the overcrowding or bring water up many stairs. 3100 BCE, world's first true city. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Uruk held around 40,000 to 50,000 people inside the city and up to 80,000 or more across the wider urban area, which was enormous for its time. That many people living close together meant the first real big city housing problem was already underway. Most homes were built from sun-dried mud brick packed tightly together, often sharing walls so entire neighborhoods felt like one solid block of clay. The streets were narrow and uneven, more like winding paths between walls than open roads, and once inside, you were surrounded by other families on all sides. A typical house had a central courtyard or main room with smaller rooms clustered around it. Because wood was hard to find in southern Mesopotamia, furniture was simple, floors were made of packed earth, and daily life was dusty and needed constant upkeep. When you repeat that basic house plan thousands of times inside a growing city, space disappears quickly. Temples and elite compounds took up the most important zones, rising above the rest, while ordinary residents built wherever there was room left. The closer you lived to the center of power, the stronger and larger your home was, and the farther away you lived, the smaller and darker it became. Uruk was a busy city of brickmakers, potters, and brewers, where workers carried goods through hot, dusty streets filled with smoke from cooking fires, and with mud brick walls trapping the heat all day. Even the standard houses found by archaeologists were probably the better ones, since the poorest shelters left little behind. So while Uruk is famous for temples and early writing, it was also one of the first times humans tried stacking tens of thousands of daily lives into one dense space. 7400 BCE, humanity's first urban experiment. Between 7400 and 6000 BCE, Çatalhöyük was not a city with streets, but a solid block of mud brick houses pressed against each other. There were no roads between buildings, so people walked across rooftops and climbed down into their homes through holes in the ceiling. Your front door was basically a ladder from the roof, and your walls were also your neighbor's walls. At its height, it is suggested that around 3,000 to 8,000 people lived packed into this tight cluster for centuries, and once that many humans settle in one place, the real problem is not space, but waste. There was no dump outside the town, so food scraps, animal bones, and human waste piled up between houses, turning the narrow spaces next to people's walls into shared garbage lanes. People tried to manage the smell by covering the garbage with layers of clay and earth, basically sealing the stink under fresh mud again and again. It worked for a while, but the trash piles kept growing, pressing against the base of houses and causing damage that needed constant repairs. Living here meant patching walls, replastering interiors, and fighting decay caused partly by your own garbage. Dogs fed on the refuse between houses, helping control some pests, but they also added more waste into the same tight spaces. Archaeologists have found signs of parasites and infection in preserved waste and bones, showing that disease likely spread as people and trash stayed close together. With no open streets, no drainage, and no way to move garbage far away, keeping things clean was a constant struggle. Çatalhöyük shows that as soon as humans built crowded homes, they also faced their first sanitation crisis. What about the future? After everything we just saw, do you think we are getting better at building cities, or are we just repeating the same problems at a bigger scale? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.